The footage I am about to describe has never been shown to the public. 7 separate incidents, all captured on camera within the boundaries of Yellowstone National Park, all featuring something that the National Park Service has spent decades trying to explain away. I know this because I was there for 3 of them. My name is Robert Kessler, and for 22 years, I served as a senior wildlife biologist for the United States National Park Service, stationed primarily at Yellowstone. What I witnessed during my career, what was recorded on government equipment and subsequently classified, would shake the foundations of everything we think we know about the American wilderness. This is not speculation. This is not folklore. This is documented evidence that changed the lives of everyone who saw it. Let me take you back to where it all began for me, September of 1991. I was 34 years old, freshly transferred from a research position at Glacier National Park to what I thought would be a prestigious posting at Yellowstone. The park was experiencing an unusual autumn that year. Temperatures had dropped early, driving elk herds down from the high country weeks ahead of schedule. The wolves hadn't been reintroduced yet. That wouldn't happen until '95, so the ecosystem dynamics were different than what visitors see today. I arrived at Mammoth Hot Springs on the 3rd of September, reported to the administrative building, and met my new supervisor, a man named Douglas Whitfield. Doug was in his late 50s, had been with the Park Service for over 30 years, and had the kind of weathered face that suggested he'd seen things that aged him beyond his years. When he shook my hand that first day, he held on a moment too long, looked me dead in the eyes, and said something I didn't understand at the time. He said, "Kessler, you're going to see things out there that don't fit in any textbook you've ever read. When that happens, you come to me first. Not your colleagues, not your friends, not your wife. Me. Understood?" I nodded, assuming he was talking about poaching incidents or maybe some classified research project. I had no idea what he really meant. My first 3 weeks were routine. I conducted wildlife surveys, monitored bear activity near campgrounds, collected water samples from thermal features for an ongoing geological study. The work was satisfying, the landscape was breathtaking, and I was settling into what I expected would be a long and fulfilling career. Then came the night of September 24th, 1991. I was stationed at a remote observation post in the Lamar Valley, about 15 miles from the nearest paved road. The Park Service had set up a series of these posts throughout the backcountry, equipped with basic amenities and, importantly for this story, early generation night vision equipment and motion-activated cameras. Our official purpose was monitoring elk migration patterns. The cameras were Sony Betacam units, state-of-the-art for the time, capable of recording in low light conditions with surprising clarity. That night, around 2:15 in the morning, I was awakened by the alarm system connected to our perimeter cameras. The motion sensors had been triggered on the north side of the valley, about 300 yards from my position. I pulled on my boots, grabbed my binoculars and flashlight, and stepped outside to investigate. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light across the grassland. I could see a herd of elk maybe half a mile away, bedded down and undisturbed. Whatever had triggered the sensors, it wasn't them. I walked toward the camera station, my breath visible in the cold air. The temperature had dropped to around 28 degrees and frost was forming on the tall grass. When I reached the camera mount, I noticed immediately that something was wrong. The unit had been physically moved, not knocked over by wind or bumped by a passing animal, but deliberately rotated on its tripod, pointing in a direction completely different from where I'd aimed it that afternoon. I checked the recording mechanism and found that 15 minutes of footage had been captured. The timestamp showed the recording had begun at 2:03 a.m. and ended at 2:18. I rewound the tape and played it back on the small monitor attached to the unit. What I saw in those 15 minutes changed my life forever. The footage began with static, then resolved into a clear night vision image of the valley floor. For the first 30 seconds, nothing moved. Then, from the left side of the frame, a figure emerged. My first thought was that it was a bear standing on its hind legs, but almost immediately I knew that assessment was wrong. The proportions were all wrong. The legs were too long, the arms hung too low, the head sat on shoulders that were impossibly broad. Whatever this was, it stood at least 7.5 feet tall, possibly more. The figure moved across the frame with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for something so large. It wasn't walking the way a bear walks on two legs, that awkward, shuffling gait that looks almost comical. This creature moved like a human, but with longer strides and a posture that suggested absolute confidence in its environment. Then the creature stopped. It turned toward the camera, and for approximately 8 seconds, it looked directly into the lens. The face was partially obscured by distance and the limitations of the night vision technology, but I could make out basic features: a heavy brow ridge, eyes that reflected the infrared illumination with an amber glow, a broad nose, and a jaw that seemed too large for a human skull. The creature's expression, if I can call it that, appeared curious rather than alarmed. It studied the camera the way a person might study an unfamiliar piece of equipment, tilting its head slightly to one side. Then it did something that made my blood run cold. It raised one massive hand and pointed directly at the camera. Not a threatening gesture, not a wave, just a single deliberate point, as if to say, "I see you, I know you're watching." The creature held that pose for perhaps 2 seconds, then turned and walked out of frame. The remaining 11 minutes of footage showed nothing but empty grassland. I stood there in the cold, replaying the tape 3 times, trying to convince myself that I'd misinterpreted what I was seeing. Maybe it was a person in a costume, some kind of prank. Maybe it was an optical illusion created by the night vision technology. But deep down, I knew none of those explanations held water. What I had recorded was real. I remembered what Doug Whitfield had told me on my first day. At 5:30 that morning, as soon as the sun began to lighten the eastern horizon, I hiked back to the nearest ranger station and radioed for a vehicle. By 8 a.m., I was sitting in Doug's office at Mammoth, the Betacam tape in my hands. Doug watched the footage in silence. When it ended, he rewound it and watched it again. Then he removed the tape from the player, placed it in his desk drawer, and locked the drawer with a key he kept on a chain around his neck. "How long has this been going on?" I asked him. Doug leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. "Documented incidents in this park go back to 1872, the year Yellowstone was established. Probably before that, if you count the Native American oral traditions. The Crow, the Shoshone, the Blackfeet, they all have stories about the tall ones who walk between the trees. We just didn't pay attention because we assumed they were legends." "How many incidents are we talking about?" "Officially, 0. The Park Service doesn't acknowledge any of this. Unofficially," he paused, seemingly calculating, "I've personally reviewed footage or physical evidence from 37 separate events since I started here in 1963. Some of it's ambiguous, could be explained away if you tried hard enough. But maybe a dozen of those cases are like what you just showed me. Clear, undeniable, impossible to dismiss." That conversation with Doug Whitfield was my introduction to a world I never knew existed, a shadow reality that runs parallel to the one most people experience. The second incident occurred in July of 1994. By then, I'd been at Yellowstone for almost 3 years and had largely convinced myself that my first sighting was an isolated event. I'd been watching the remote camera footage regularly, but nothing unusual had appeared. Then came the thermal imaging incident at Old Faithful. The park had recently acquired a new thermal imaging system for research purposes. We were using it to study the underground hydrothermal features, mapping heat signatures to better understand the complex plumbing system beneath Yellowstone's surface. The equipment was expensive, cutting edge for 1994, and required significant training to operate properly. I was part of a 4-person team conducting overnight surveys near the Old Faithful Geyser Basin. Our camp was set up about a quarter mile from the main tourist area, which was closed after dark for safety reasons. We had the thermal imaging equipment mounted on a tripod, scanning the landscape in a slow pan to capture data. At approximately 1:45 a.m., our team leader, a woman named Dr. Patricia Vance, noticed something unusual on the display. She called me over to look. On the thermal screen, moving through the geyser basin from north to south, was a heat signature that didn't match anything we expected to see. It was roughly humanoid in shape, but much larger than any person, and it was walking through an area where the ground temperature exceeded 200 degrees Fahrenheit. Any human or animal that attempted to walk through that zone would suffer severe burns within seconds. This figure was moving through it casually, as if the extreme heat was of no concern whatsoever. We watched in stunned silence as the heat signature navigated between thermal features with obvious familiarity. It knew exactly where to step, which areas to avoid, which paths were safe. At one point, it paused near a small geyser that erupted while we watched, the thermal plume of superheated water shooting up beside the figure. It didn't flinch, didn't move away. It simply waited for the eruption to subside, then continued on its path. The encounter lasted approximately 12 minutes. During that time, we captured continuous thermal footage of something that should not have existed. The equipment recorded body temperature data that was completely inconsistent with known biology. The figure's core temperature appeared to be significantly higher than any mammals should be, almost as if it had adapted to thrive in geothermal environments that would kill anything else. When the figure finally disappeared into the tree line on the southern edge of the basin, Dr. Vance turned off the recording and looked at each of us in turn. "Nobody talks about this," she said. "Not to anyone, not ever. Understood?" We all nodded. What else could we do? We'd just witnessed something that defied every principle of biology we'd ever learned. That footage, like the tape from 1991, was transferred to Doug Whitfield and subsequently disappeared into whatever archive consumed these impossible records. The third incident is the one that broke people, the one that made 3 veteran rangers walk away from careers they'd dedicated their lives to. I wasn't present when it happened, but I was one of the first people to view the footage, and I understand completely why those men resigned. It occurred in October of 1997 during a routine patrol of the Thoroughfare region, which is considered the most remote area in the lower 48 states. The nearest road is over 30 miles away, and the terrain is so rugged that most visitors never venture there. Ranger Thomas Brightwater and his team of 2 junior rangers were conducting a week-long patrol through the area, documenting trail conditions and checking for illegal hunting activity. They carried standard equipment, including a video camera for documenting any violations they might encounter. On the 4th day of their patrol, around 3 in the afternoon, they entered a valley that Brightwater later described as feeling wrong. The junior rangers, Michael Chen and Sarah Hollister, reported similar sensations. The birds had stopped singing. The usual forest sounds had gone completely silent. It was as if someone had pressed a mute button on the entire landscape. Brightwater decided to investigate. He instructed Chen to keep the video camera recording as they moved forward. What they found in the center of that valley defied any explanation I've ever been able to construct. There was a clearing roughly circular, about 50 feet in diameter. The grass and vegetation within the clearing had been flattened in a pattern that radiated outward from a central point. like the petals of a flower. In the exact center of this pattern sat a pile of objects that made no sense in context. There were bones, animal bones that appeared to come from at least 3 different species: elk, deer, and what was later identified as a mountain lion. The bones were arranged in a deliberate geometric pattern, stacked and interlocked in ways that suggested intentional placement rather than random accumulation. Mixed among the bones were stones, river rocks of various sizes, also arranged with obvious purpose, and surrounding the entire assemblage was a ring of pine branches, stripped of their needles and woven together into a continuous circle. That's when they noticed the figures watching them from the tree line. There were 3 of them standing about 60 yards away among the Douglas firs that bordered the clearing. They were tall, covered in dark hair, and utterly motionless, watching, just watching. Chen captured approximately 4 minutes of footage showing the creatures before Brightwater made the decision to withdraw. The 3 rangers backed slowly out of the clearing, never taking their eyes off the figures in the trees. The creatures didn't follow, didn't move at all during the entire encounter. They simply observed, as if studying the humans' reaction to what they'd found. The rangers hiked 23 miles in a day and a half to reach the nearest road, where they radioed for emergency extraction. All 3 were showing signs of severe psychological distress by the time they were picked up. I viewed that tape 2 days later in Doug Whitfield's office. What I saw was exactly as Brightwater had described. The clearing, the arrangement of bones and stones, the woven ring of branches, and the figures standing motionless among the trees. But there was something else in that footage, something that didn't become apparent until we slowed down the playback and examined it frame by frame. The creatures weren't just watching. They were moving, but so slowly that it was imperceptible at normal speed. Over the 4 minutes of footage, each figure had shifted position by approximately 8 to 10 inches. They were drifting toward the clearing, toward the camera, in movements so gradual that the human eye couldn't detect them in real time. The implication was terrifying. These creatures had somehow understood that rapid movement would trigger a flight response in the humans, so they moved slowly enough to avoid detection while still closing the distance. If the rangers had stayed longer, those figures would have been upon them before they realized what was happening. Within 48 hours, all 3 rangers had submitted their resignations. Brightwater cited personal reasons. Chen and Hollister provided no explanation at all. They simply walked away from careers they'd spent years building. The 4th incident occurred in the summer of 2002, and unlike the previous events, this one involved civilian witnesses as well as park staff. A family from Ohio, the Hendersons, were camping in the Slough Creek area. There were 4 of them: father, mother, 2 children aged 11 and 14. They'd set up camp in the late afternoon, cooked dinner over a fire, and settled in for what they expected would be a peaceful night in the wilderness. Around midnight, the mother, whose name was Patricia, was awakened by what she described as a feeling of being watched. She lay in her sleeping bag for several minutes listening to the sounds of the forest, telling herself she was imagining things. Then she heard something outside the tent. Not an animal sound, not the rustle of a bear or the yip of a coyote. It was breathing, slow, deep, rhythmic breathing, coming from something very large that was standing directly outside the thin fabric wall of their tent. Patricia woke her husband, Gerald, who grabbed a flashlight and carefully unzipped the tent flap to look outside. What he saw made him freeze in absolute terror. Standing less than 10 feet from their tent was a creature that matched every description I'd heard over the years. Massive, covered in dark hair, standing upright on 2 legs, looking down at Gerald with eyes that reflected the flashlight beam like amber coins. The creature made no threatening moves, displayed no aggression whatsoever. It simply stood there, watching Gerald watch it. The encounter lasted approximately 2 minutes. Then the creature turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness with surprisingly little sound for something so large. The Hendersons packed up their camp immediately, loaded everything into their car by flashlight, and drove straight to the Mammoth Ranger Station, arriving at approximately 3:15 in the morning. They were clearly traumatized, especially the children. I was called in to interview the family and assess the situation. Gerald Henderson was an accountant, a practical man with no interest in cryptozoology. His description of what he'd seen was detailed, consistent, and delivered with matter-of-fact precision. He wasn't embellishing or dramatizing. He was simply reporting what had happened. I documented their account in detail, took photographs of their campsite the following morning, and collected soil samples from the area where the creature had reportedly stood. The samples showed compression patterns consistent with something weighing between 500 and 700 pounds, standing in one place for an extended period. The Hendersons wanted answers, explanations, some official acknowledgement that what they'd seen was real. I couldn't give them that. Instead, I offered the standard explanations we used in these situations. Possible misidentification of a bear, effects of sleep deprivation. None of these satisfied them, and I wouldn't have expected them to. What I couldn't tell them was that we'd had 3 other reports from the Slough Creek area. That same month, something was active in that sector. Gerald refused to stay quiet about what he'd seen. He contacted local news stations, posted about his experience on early internet forums. We managed to discredit most of his claims through the usual channels, suggesting he was seeking attention. But I always felt guilty about that. Gerald Henderson was telling the truth, and we destroyed his credibility to protect a secret. I tried to contact Gerald a few years later, after my conscience had been eating at me. I wanted to apologize, to let him know that what he experienced was real, that he wasn't crazy, and that I was sorry for what we'd done to him. But when I finally tracked down his phone number and called, his wife Patricia answered. She told me Gerald had passed away in 2007 from a heart attack. She said he'd never stopped talking about what happened that night in Yellowstone, that it haunted him until the day he died. The way people looked at him when he told the story, the dismissive smiles, the patronizing nods. He knew what he'd seen, and it broke something inside him that no one believed him. I hung up the phone and sat in my kitchen for a long time, thinking about the cost of secrets, about who really pays the price when institutions decide to hide the truth. The 5th incident was different from the others because it involved not a sighting but a recording, an audio recording that captured something that shouldn't exist. It happened in March of 2005, when the park was still largely inaccessible due to heavy snow. A research team studying wolfpack dynamics had set up a series of audio monitoring stations throughout the northern range. The goal was to record wolf howls and other vocalizations, tracking communication patterns between different packs. The equipment was designed to activate automatically when it detected sounds, within certain frequency ranges, recording everything to digital files that were collected and analyzed weekly. One of the monitoring stations, located in a particularly remote section of the Pelican Valley, captured something that no one could explain. The recording was approximately 18 minutes long and consisted of vocalizations that matched no known animal in the Yellowstone ecosystem. The sounds started as low, rumbling calls, almost subsonic, at the very bottom of the frequency range the equipment could detect. These gradually increased in pitch and complexity, developing into something that resembled language. Not any human language I'd ever heard, but structured sounds that repeated in patterns with clear variations that suggested meaning. There were what appeared to be calls and responses, one vocalization followed by a different one from a slightly different direction, as if 2 individuals were having a conversation. The research team, led by Dr. James Corrigan from Montana State University, initially assumed the equipment had malfunctioned. They checked the electronics, verified the software was working correctly, and concluded that whatever they'd recorded was real. They just couldn't identify what had made the sounds. Dr. Corrigan brought the recording to park administration, asking for help in identifying the source. That's when Doug Whitfield, by then nearing retirement, asked me to review it. I listened to the 18-minute recording in its entirety 3 times. By the 3rd time, I was certain of what I was hearing. It was them, the creatures. Whatever they were, they had a language. Not random vocalizations, not simple animal calls, but structured, complex communication that suggested sophisticated intelligence. The implications were staggering. If these beings had developed language, what else had they developed? What kind of social structures did they maintain? What did they discuss with each other during those long conversations in the darkness of the wilderness? I convinced Doug to classify the recording and prevent it from being released to the broader scientific community. Dr. Corrigan was understandably frustrated. He'd captured what he believed was evidence of unknown wildlife and wanted to pursue it. But we explained that the recording would raise more questions than it answered and could potentially compromise ongoing research efforts in the area. It was a weak excuse, but Corrigan eventually accepted it. That audio file sits somewhere in the same archive as all the other evidence we collected over the years. 18 minutes of proof that something intelligent, something capable of language, lives in the remote corners of Yellowstone. And nobody outside a handful of government employees has ever heard it. The thing that kept me awake at night wasn't the individual incidents. It was the pattern they formed when you looked at all of them together. These creatures weren't just surviving in Yellowstone. They were thriving. They had adapted their behavior to avoid detection with almost perfect efficiency. They understood our technology well enough to manipulate cameras, to stay just outside the range of our monitoring equipment, to move in ways that confounded our attempts to document them. And they were intelligent. Not just animal clever, not just instinctively cautious. They were strategically intelligent. They made decisions. They communicated complex information to each other. They had what appeared to be cultural practices, rituals involving bones and stones that we couldn't begin to understand. The question that haunted me wasn't whether they existed. After everything I'd seen, that was no longer in doubt. The question was what they wanted. Why did they sometimes allow themselves to be seen? Why did that creature point at my camera back in '91? Why did the beings in the thoroughfare stand there watching the rangers instead of simply disappearing into the forest? Were they testing us, studying us the way we were trying to study them? I asked Doug these questions once, late in his career, when he was preparing for retirement. He poured us both a glass of whiskey, something he kept in his desk drawer for special occasions, and he told me something I've never forgotten. "Kessler," he said, "I've been doing this for over 40 years. I've seen more footage, more evidence, more impossible things than you can imagine. And the only conclusion I've ever been able to reach is that they're waiting for something. What that something is, I couldn't tell you. But there's a patience to them, a deliberateness, that suggests they're playing a much longer game than we are. We've been in this park for 130 years. They've probably been here for thousands, maybe tens of thousands. We're the newcomers here, not them. And I think they're still trying to figure out what to do about us." Doug retired in 2006. He moved to a small town in Montana, bought a cabin on the edge of the wilderness, and spent his remaining years fishing and reading and watching the tree lines at dawn and dusk. He died in 2015, peacefully in his sleep. I was one of only 4 people at his funeral. The others were his sister, his ex-wife, and a man I didn't recognize who turned out to be another former Park Service employee from the 1970s. We didn't talk about the things we'd seen. We didn't have to. Some bonds are formed through shared secrets, and those bonds don't require words. The sixth incident occurred in August of 2009, and it remains the most visually compelling piece of evidence I've ever encountered. It happened during a controlled burn operation in the southern section of the park, a routine procedure used to reduce fuel loads and prevent catastrophic wildfires. The fire crews were using aerial drones to monitor the burn's progress, an early application of technology that would become standard practice in later years. The drones were equipped with high-definition cameras and thermal imaging systems, providing real-time footage to the incident commander on the ground. One of the drones, operating about 3 miles ahead of the fire line, captured footage of something fleeing the approaching flames. At first, the operator assumed it was a bear or an elk, common sights during burn operations as wildlife evacuated ahead of the fire. But as the drone closed the distance, the operator realized he was looking at something entirely different. The creature was running upright, on 2 legs, at a speed that seemed impossible for something so large. The thermal imaging showed a heat signature that was larger and more intense than any bear's, and the body proportions were all wrong for any known animal. The footage showed the creature covering ground in enormous strides, leaping over fallen logs and dense vegetation with an agility that defied its size. Then the creature did something that elevated this footage above all the others I'd seen. It looked up directly at the drone hovering overhead and changed direction. It started running toward a thick stand of trees that would provide cover from aerial observation. Somehow it understood that it was being watched from above and took deliberate action to break contact. The total footage was approximately 90 seconds before the creature disappeared into the forest canopy. But in that 90 seconds, we captured clearer imagery of one of these beings than anything that had come before. The resolution was high enough to see individual features, the texture of the hair, the movement of muscles beneath the skin, the way the creature's eyes tracked the drone's position even while it was running at full speed. When the incident commander reviewed the footage that evening, he immediately contacted park administration. The drone operator, a young man named Kevin Marsh, was clearly shaken by what he'd seen. He kept asking what it was, and I kept telling him I didn't know. The footage disappeared into the archive, and another piece of evidence was buried. I sometimes wonder what happened to all those tapes, all those recordings, all those photographs and samples we collected over the decades. There must be a room somewhere, a vault or a warehouse, filled with filing cabinets and hard drives and storage media containing proof that would change everything we think we know about the world. But I don't know where it is. I don't know who controls it, and I don't know what they plan to do with it. What I do know is that somewhere in those files is the evidence that would vindicate every witness we ever discredited, every ranger who resigned rather than keep lying, every civilian who was made to feel crazy for reporting what they saw. Somewhere in those files is the truth. The 7th and final incident happened in October of 2012, less than a year before my retirement. By then, I'd spent over 2 decades collecting and cataloging evidence that contradicted everything the public was told about our national parks. I'd seen footage, reviewed photographs, listened to recordings, and interviewed witnesses. I'd watched colleagues resign rather than continue participating in the cover-up. And I'd questioned my own role in maintaining a secret that perhaps shouldn't have been kept. But nothing had prepared me for what would happen on that autumn afternoon in the Hayden Valley. This incident was personal in a way the others weren't. It happened to me directly during what was supposed to be a routine wildlife survey. No cameras caught it, no recording devices preserved it. It exists only in my memory, burned there with a clarity that time has done nothing to diminish. I was alone that day, which was unusual but not unheard of for a senior researcher conducting a low-risk survey. The weather was beautiful, clear skies and temperatures in the mid-50s, perfect conditions for observing the bison herds that congregate in Hayden Valley during the fall. I'd set up an observation post on a hillside overlooking the valley floor, my spotting scope trained on a group of about 40 bison grazing near the Yellowstone River. The morning passed peacefully. I took notes on herd composition, counted calves, documented the behavior of several large bulls that were still displaying remnants of their rutting aggression. The sun moved across the sky, and I ate the lunch I'd packed, a turkey sandwich and an apple, while watching a golden eagle circle overhead. It was the kind of day that reminded me why I'd chosen this career in the first place, why I'd spent my life in wild places instead of behind a desk in some city office. Around 4 in the afternoon, I noticed that the bison were becoming agitated. Their behavior changed abruptly from calm grazing to alert vigilance. Heads came up, bodies oriented toward the same direction, the classic prey species response to detecting a predator. I'd seen this reaction hundreds of times over the years, usually triggered by a grizzly bear or a wolf pack moving through the area. I scanned the landscape with my binoculars, looking for whatever had triggered the response. I checked the tree lines to the north and south, swept across the river, examined the rolling hills that bordered the valley. Nothing. No bears, no wolves, no obvious threat. But the bison remained on high alert, some of them beginning to move away from whatever they sensed. Their instincts were telling them something was wrong, and bison instincts had been honed by millions of years of evolution. They knew something I didn't. That's when I noticed something at the edge of the tree line, about 200 yards from my position. At first, I thought it was a shadow, a trick of the afternoon light playing across the dark trunks of the lodgepole pines. But shadows don't move the way this one moved. Shadows don't step forward from concealment and stand motionless in the gap between two trees. It was watching me, not the bison, not the river, not the general landscape, me specifically. I could feel the weight of its attention like a physical pressure, like someone had placed a hand on my chest and was slowly increasing the force. I raised my binoculars with trembling hands and focused on the figure. What I saw confirmed every piece of footage I'd reviewed, every witness statement I'd taken, every nightmare I'd had since that first night in the Lamar Valley 21 years earlier. The creature stood at least 8 feet tall, its body covered in dark reddish-brown hair that caught the late afternoon sunlight. The shoulders were impossibly broad, the arms long and muscular, hanging at its sides with a relaxed confidence that suggested it had no fear of me whatsoever. The face was partially shadowed by the trees, but I could make out the heavy brow ridge, the flat nose, the prominent jaw, and the eyes, dark, intelligent, fixed on my location with unmistakable focus. We regarded each other across that distance for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 or 40 seconds. My heart was hammering against my ribs. My mouth had gone completely dry. Every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to run, to flee, to put as much distance as possible between myself and this impossible thing that had stepped out of legend and into my reality. But I didn't run. I couldn't run. Something held me in place, some mixture of terror and awe and a strange, inexplicable sense that this moment was important, that it meant something beyond my ability to understand. Then I remembered my camera. It was in my pack, less than 2 feet away, loaded with fresh film and capable of capturing clear images at this distance. All I had to do was reach for it, aim, and press the shutter. I'd have photographic evidence that would vindicate every witness I'd ever interviewed, every piece of footage I'd ever helped classify. I'd have proof. My hand moved toward the pack, slowly, carefully. I didn't want to startle the creature, didn't want it to disappear before I could document this encounter. My fingers touched the zipper, began to pull it open, and then the creature did something that stopped me cold. It shook its head, a slow, deliberate movement from side to side, unmistakably a gesture of negation. No. I froze, my hand still on the zipper. The creature held my gaze for another moment, then raised one massive hand and placed it over its chest, over what I presumed was its heart. It held that pose for perhaps 3 seconds. Then it dropped its hand, turned, and walked back into the forest. Within moments, it had vanished completely. The shadows swallowed it as if it had never been there at all. The bison gradually calmed, resuming their grazing. The eagle continued to circle overhead. The world returned to normal, except that nothing would ever be normal for me again. I sat there on that hillside for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. The creature had communicated with me, not in words, not in any language I could name, but in gestures that transcended the barrier between our species. It had told me not to take the photograph, and then it had placed its hand over its heart in a gesture that seemed almost like gratitude or perhaps acknowledgement. What did it mean? Was it thanking me for choosing not to document the encounter? Was it recognizing something in me, some quality that distinguished me from other humans it had observed? Or was it simply acknowledging the moment of connection between us, the brief instant when two intelligent beings from different worlds had looked into each other's eyes and seen something they recognized? I never took the photograph. I left my camera in my pack and watched the sun set over the Hayden Valley, thinking about everything I'd experienced over the past 2 decades, everything I'd learned, everything I'd hidden, and I made a decision that would define the rest of my life. The creature's message had been clear, even without words. It was asking me to choose, to decide in that moment what kind of human I wanted to be. Was I the kind who would exploit this encounter for fame, for proof, for the satisfaction of being right? Or was I the kind who could recognize that some things are more important than evidence, more sacred than scientific discovery? I thought about all the witnesses I had interviewed over the years, the ones who'd been ridiculed, the ones who'd lost friendships and marriages because people thought they were crazy, the ones who'd been professionally destroyed for telling the truth. I thought about how different their lives might have been if they'd had photographic proof of what they'd seen. I thought about how vindicated they would feel, how validated, how relieved. And then I thought about what that proof would cost. The hunting parties, the research expeditions, the military response to what they would surely classify as a potential threat. The end of everything these creatures had built, over thousands of years of careful concealment. All of it, destroyed because one man wanted to prove he wasn't crazy. I couldn't do it. In that moment, with the creature watching me from the tree line, I understood something I'd been struggling to grasp for 21 years. The secret wasn't a burden, it was a trust, a sacred responsibility passed from those who had seen to those who would never see. The creatures had chosen to reveal themselves to certain people for reasons we couldn't understand, and those people had a duty to protect what they'd been shown. When I returned to Mammoth that evening, I didn't report what I'd seen. For the first time in my career, I kept an encounter to myself. Maybe it was hypocrisy, after all the pressure I'd put on witnesses to stay silent. Maybe it was a belated recognition that some secrets deserved to be kept. Or maybe I'd simply reached a point where I no longer wanted to be part of a system that treated these beings as threats to be monitored rather than mysteries to be respected. I retired 9 months later, in July of 2013. My personnel file shows nothing unusual, just another career park employee reaching the end of his service. There was a small ceremony, a cake, some handshakes, and a plaque thanking me for 22 years of dedicated work. Nobody mentioned the real work I'd done, the evidence I'd collected, the secrets I'd kept. That part of my career didn't officially exist. I moved to a small house in Bozeman, Montana, close enough to Yellowstone that I could visit whenever I wanted, far enough away that I wasn't constantly reminded of everything I'd seen there. I spent my first year of retirement hiking, fishing, reading books I'd never had time for during my working years. I tried to live a normal life, whatever that meant for someone who knew what I knew, but the memories wouldn't leave me alone. At night, I'd lie awake thinking about the footage, the recordings, the witnesses whose lives had been damaged by their encounters with the impossible. I thought about Gerald Henderson dying with no one believing his story. I thought about Thomas Brightwater and his team walking away from careers they'd devoted their lives to because they couldn't unsee what they'd seen. I thought about Doug Whitfield spending his final years watching the tree lines at dawn and dusk, still looking for answers that never came. And I thought about that creature in the Hayden Valley, the one that had looked at me across 200 yards of wilderness and shaken its head when I reached for my camera, the one that had placed its hand over its heart before disappearing into the forest. What had it been trying to tell me? What message had it been trying to convey? In 2018, 5 years after my retirement, I received a phone call that brought everything back into focus. It was from a woman named Jennifer Whitfield, Doug's niece. She told me that Doug had left me something in his will, a box of materials he wanted me to have. She didn't know what was in it. She just knew he'd been very specific that it should go to me and no one else. I drove to the address she gave me, a storage facility outside of Billings, and retrieved the box. It was heavy, sealed with packing tape that had yellowed with age. I took it home and opened it on my kitchen table, not knowing what to expect. Inside were Doug's personal journals, dozens of them spanning his entire career from 1963 to 2006. Handwritten accounts of every incident he'd investigated, every piece of evidence he'd reviewed, every conversation he'd had with witnesses and officials and fellow believers. It was the unofficial history of Yellowstone's greatest secret, documented by the man who had spent more time studying it than anyone else. I spent the next 6 months reading those journals. What I found was both horrifying and illuminating. Doug had documented over 200 incidents during his career, far more than the 37 he'd mentioned to me. He'd tracked patterns in the sightings, noting that certain areas of the park seemed to be hot spots for activity, places where the creatures appeared more frequently than others. He'd developed theories about their behavior, their social structure, their possible origins. But the most disturbing entries were the ones that detailed the government's response to his findings. Doug had been pressured repeatedly to destroy evidence, to falsify reports, to discredit witnesses who refused to stay silent. He'd received visits from men in dark suits who asked questions but provided no identification. He'd been threatened with termination, with prosecution, with consequences he didn't specify in his journals. And yet, he'd kept going. Year after year, decade after decade, Doug had continued to collect and document evidence that the government wanted buried. He'd created a parallel archive, a shadow record that existed only in his handwritten journals, hidden from the officials who would have destroyed it if they'd known it existed. The final entry in the last journal was dated 2 weeks before Doug's death. It read simply, "Kessler will know what to do with this. He's one of the few who still cares about the truth." I sat at my kitchen table and cried for the first time since my wife had left me in 1998. I cried for Doug, for the burden he'd carried for so long. I cried for all the witnesses who'd been silenced, all the evidence that had been buried, all the truth that had been sacrificed on the altar of institutional convenience. And I cried for myself, for the years I'd spent participating in a cover-up that I was only now beginning to understand the full scope of. The journals revealed things I'd never known, things Doug had kept even from me. He'd been contacted by researchers from other countries, Scientists who had documented similar phenomena in the forests of Russia, in the mountains of China, in the remote wilderness areas of Canada and Australia. This wasn't just an American secret, it was a global one. Whatever these creatures were, they existed on every continent with sufficient wilderness to hide them. They were a worldwide phenomenon that every major government had independently discovered and independently decided to conceal. Doug had also documented encounters that went beyond simple sightings. There were entries describing what appeared to be deliberate communication attempts, creatures leaving arranged objects near research stations, vocalizations that seemed designed to attract attention rather than avoid it. In one particularly disturbing entry from 1987, Doug described finding a series of symbols carved into trees along a hiking trail, symbols that matched ones he'd seen in photographs from the Soviet Union and the Australian outback. The creatures weren't just intelligent. They had a shared culture that spanned continents. What do you do when you're entrusted with a secret that could change the world? What do you do when telling the truth might cause more harm than keeping silent? These are the questions I've wrestled with for the past 7 years, ever since I opened that box and began reading Doug's journals. Part of me wants to release everything, scan the journals, upload them to the internet, let the world see what's been hidden for so long. Let scientists study the evidence. Let the public decide for themselves what to believe. Blow the whole conspiracy wide open and damn the consequences. But another part of me remembers that creature in the Hayden Valley, shaking its head when I reached for my camera. These beings have survived by remaining hidden. They've adapted their entire existence around avoiding detection by our species. If I release this information, if I prove once and for all that they exist, what happens to them? I think about the history of humanity's relationship with other species. We haven't exactly covered ourselves in glory. We've hunted countless animals to extinction. We've destroyed habitats, polluted ecosystems, caged and studied and dissected everything we could get our hands on. Would we treat these creatures any differently? Would we respect their right to exist on their own terms, in their own way? Or would we do what we've always done? Try to control what we can't understand? The Patterson-Gimlin film from 1967 sparked decades of Bigfoot hunting, with armed men tramping through the wilderness, hoping to shoot one and prove the skeptics wrong. If I released evidence that was even more compelling, how many more hunters would descend on Yellowstone? How many more researchers with tranquilizer guns and tracking devices? How many more curious tourists wandering into the backcountry, putting themselves and the creatures at risk? I don't have good answers to these questions. I'm not sure anyone does. All I know is that the decision weighs on me every single day, and I suspect it will continue to weigh on me until the day I die. What I can tell you is this. I'm 77 years old now. I've lived a long life, seen things that most people can't imagine, and kept secrets that have shaped my entire existence. I've watched colleagues and friends destroyed by knowledge they were never supposed to possess. I've participated in a cover-up that may have been necessary but was certainly not just. And I've come face to face with something that challenged every assumption I'd ever made about the world and my place in it. There are things in Yellowstone National Park that don't appear in any guidebook, that aren't mentioned in any ranger presentation, that exist completely outside the awareness of the 3 million visitors who pass through those gates every year. These beings are real. They're intelligent. They've been here far longer than we have, and they've earned the right to decide whether they want to be found. The 7 incidents I've described represent only a fraction of what I witnessed and documented during my career. There are dozens more in Doug's journals, hundreds perhaps if you count the entries from other parks and forests where similar activity has been reported. The evidence exists. It's been collected, cataloged and hidden away in archives that most people will never know about. Some people believe the government should release this evidence, should acknowledge what's been hidden for so long. They argue that the public has a right to know what lives in their national parks, what secrets are being kept in their name. I understand that argument. I even sympathize with it. But then I remember that moment on the hillside, the creature watching me from the tree line, the slow shake of its head when I reached for my camera, the hand placed over its heart before it disappeared into the forest. That wasn't the behavior of an animal. That was the behavior of a being making a choice, communicating a preference, asking me to respect its desire to remain unknown. How do I betray that trust? How do I honor Doug's legacy while also honoring the unspoken agreement I made with that creature in the Hayden Valley? How do I balance the public's right to know against these beings' right to exist in peace? I've made my decision, at least for now. I'm not going to release the journals or the evidence they contain. I'm not going to name the specific locations where activity has been documented or provide details that could be used to track these creatures down. What I've shared in this account is enough to let people know that the phenomenon is real without giving them the tools to destroy it. Maybe that's cowardly. Maybe future generations will curse me for keeping silent when I could have changed the course of scientific history. Maybe the truth will come out eventually anyway, and all my caution will have been for nothing. But I keep coming back to that moment on the hillside. The creature and I, two intelligent beings from different worlds, looking at each other across a gap that should have been unbridgeable. And somehow, in that moment, we understood each other. We recognized something in each other that transcended species and language and everything that separates the known from the unknown. It asked me not to take the photograph, not in words, but in a gesture that was clear enough to understand. And I honored that request, even though it meant walking away from the proof I'd spent 2 decades searching for. Some secrets are kept not because we're afraid of the truth, but because we finally understand that the truth isn't ours to reveal. Some mysteries deserve to remain unsolved. Some beings deserve their privacy, and some promises, even the unspoken ones, are worth keeping. If you ever visit Yellowstone, especially the backcountry, the remote areas where trails are faint and other hikers are rare, pay attention. Watch the tree lines at dawn and dusk. Listen to the sounds that don't quite match any animal you know. Feel the weight of being watched, even when you can't see what's watching you. And if you're fortunate enough or unfortunate enough, depending on your perspective, to see something that shouldn't exist, something tall and dark and ancient, watching you with eyes that seem to understand exactly what you are, I'm asking you to do what I did on that hillside in 2012. Let them go. Don't reach for your camera. Don't chase after them. Don't try to prove what you've seen to anyone else. Just let them fade back into the forest, back into the shadows where they've lived for thousands of years, back into the realm of legend and mystery where they belong. They've survived this long by staying hidden. They've adapted to a world that increasingly has no room for things that can't be categorized and controlled. They've watched us spread across their territory, cut down their forests, poison their waters, and still they've persisted. The least we can do is grant them the dignity of remaining unknown. That's my story. That's what I saw during my 22 years in Yellowstone. And that's why I've chosen to keep most of it secret even now. The evidence exists. The truth is out there, locked away in archives and journals and the memories of people like me who've seen too much to ever go back to believing in a simple, explainable world. But the creatures themselves, the beings who make Yellowstone their home, who've walked those forests since before the park existed, since before Europeans set foot on this continent, since before recorded history began, they deserve to keep their secrets. They've earned that right. There's one more thing I need to tell you before I finish. One more piece of the puzzle that I've carried with me all these years. In the summer of 2019, 6 years after my retirement, I made one final trip to Yellowstone. It wasn't planned. I woke up one morning with an overwhelming urge to go back, to see the places where I'd spent the best and most troubling years of my career. I packed a bag, got in my truck, and drove the 90 miles from Bozeman to the park's north entrance. I spent 3 days there, revisiting the locations where the incidents had occurred. I went to the Lamar Valley where I'd captured that first footage 28 years earlier. I walked through the geyser basin near Old Faithful, remembering the thermal imaging encounter. I even hiked into the thoroughfare region, as far as my 72-year-old legs would carry me, thinking about Brightwater and his team and the ritual site they'd found. On my last evening in the park, I drove to the Hayden Valley. I parked at the same pullout I'd used in 2012, hiked to the same hillside, and sat down to watch the sunset. The bison were there, a different herd than the one I'd observed 7 years earlier, but behaving the same way bison always behave in that valley, grazing, occasionally sparring, settling in for the approaching night. I watched them through my binoculars, not really looking for anything, just enjoying the peace of being in a place I loved. As the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple and gold, I felt that familiar sensation, the weight of being watched, the pressure of attention from something I couldn't see. I lowered my binoculars and looked toward the tree line, toward the same stand of lodgepole pines where the creature had appeared all those years ago. And there it was. Or perhaps not the same one. Perhaps a different individual, a younger one, watching me from the shadows just as its elder had done. We looked at each other across the distance, across the years, across the gulf that separates our species. I didn't reach for a camera. I didn't have one with me. I'd left all my equipment at home, wanting nothing between me and the wilderness but my own eyes and memories. The creature raised its hand, slowly, deliberately. It placed its palm over its chest, over its heart, in the same gesture I'd seen before. Then it inclined its head, just slightly, in what I can only describe as a nod of recognition. And then it was gone, melting back into the forest as silently as it had appeared. I sat on that hillside until full dark, tears streaming down my face, overwhelmed by a feeling I couldn't name. Gratitude, perhaps. Closure. A sense that something had come full circle, that a conversation begun 7 years ago had finally reached its conclusion. They remember us. That's what I realized in that moment. They remember the humans they've encountered, the ones who kept their secrets, the ones who chose not to exploit what they'd seen. They're watching, always watching, and they remember who proved worthy of their trust. I drove back to Bozeman that night, and I haven't returned to Yellowstone since. I don't need to. I've made my peace with everything I experienced there, everything I learned, everything I kept hidden. The creatures know I honored my promise. That's enough for me. I'm 77 years old now. I won't live forever. Someday the journals Doug left me will pass to someone else, and they'll have to make their own decision about what to do with them. Maybe they'll choose differently than I have. Maybe the world will be ready to receive this information by then. Maybe humanity will have evolved to the point where we can encounter another intelligent species without trying to capture, study, and exploit it. I hope so. I really do. Because these beings are remarkable. They're intelligent. They're adaptable. They're survivors in the truest sense of the word. And they're our neighbors sharing this planet with us, even though most of us will never know they exist. I've often wondered what it must be like for them to watch us from the shadows generation after generation as our technology advances and our population grows and our cities spread ever further into their territory. To see us as we truly are, not as we imagine ourselves to be. To witness our capacity for destruction and our capacity for kindness, our greed and our generosity. our fear of the unknown, and our endless curiosity about it. They must have opinions about us. They must discuss us in their language, in those rumbling vocalizations that sound almost like speech. They must have stories passed down through generations about the strange creatures who walk on two legs like they do, but who are so different in every other way. Stories about humans who proved worthy of trust and humans who proved dangerous. Stories about the world as it was before we came and the world as it is now. What do those stories say? What conclusions have they drawn about our species? Do they see any hope for us? Any possibility that we might someday earn their respect rather than just their caution? I'll never know the answers to those questions, but I like to think that if they're watching me now, if they're somehow aware that I'm finally sharing this story, they understand why I've waited so long and why I'm still holding so much back. I like to think they know I'm trying to honor the trust they placed in me, until the day comes when we're ready to meet them as equals, as fellow travelers on this spinning rock in the vastness of space. I'll keep their secret. I'll honor the request that creature made on that October afternoon when it shook its head and placed its hand over its heart and trusted me to understand. Some things are worth protecting, some truths are worth hiding, and some encounters change you so profoundly that you can never go back to being the person you were before. That's what happened to me in Yellowstone. That's what those 7 incidents captured on camera and burned into my memory taught me about the world and my place in it. And now, for the first time in my life, I've told someone. Not everything. Not the details that could be used to hunt them down, but enough. Enough to let people know that the mystery is real, that the legends have foundation, that there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophy. What you do with this information is up to you. Believe it or dismiss it. Share it or keep it to yourself. But if you ever find yourself in the wilderness, surrounded by ancient trees and the sounds of a world that existed long before we did, remember what I've told you. Watch the tree lines. Listen to the silence. And if something watches you back, have the wisdom to let it go. They've been waiting a long time for us to learn that lesson. I hope, for all our sakes, that we finally do.